Hi class, this is chapter 15, Psychological Disorders. And I like to always caveat this class before I start it by telling students not to be alarmed. We have a class called Abnormal Psychology that I just love teaching, mostly because it really fits in really well with my forensic practice, my private practice. But I tell them, if you see yourself in one of these disorders, don't worry. You're in class, so you're doing okay. You don't have to worry about having a psychological disorder. It's only as it becomes a disorder, a diagnosable disorder when you're having difficulty doing your activities of daily living. So the DSM-5, which just came up, I guess it came up maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It's fairly recent. We had the DSM-4 for years and years and years. The DSM-5 defines a mental disorder as a syndrome. The syndrome is a set of related conditions of clinically significant disturbances of thoughts, feelings, or behavior. So any given year, 26% of the population is going to have a diagnosable disorder. Over the course of a lifetime, 46% of adults will have at least one psychological disorder. More than half of the 46% will have 2 or more disorders. Now, there's the 4 Ds of mental disorder. And this really is what distinguishes somebody who has a mental disorder from somebody who's disabled with a mental disorder. And that's the disabling part that's the biggest concern. First, and the text talks about it here in your text. I'm going to look down at it at my notes here. Page 569 in the text will show that a mental disorder is disturbance of thought. First, there's disturbance of thought, emotion, or behavior. So we have that as one component. Then there is dysfunction of biological or developmental processes. So that means, I'm not able to accomplish a particular task. And it's distress or disability in everyday life. And it's deviant, which is thought, emotion, or behavior, but only if it's also dysfunctional. And that's the key word there. There's a lot of deviant people that are out there that are not necessarily fall in this category. For example, Shaquille O'Neal, is he deviant? Definitely. He's like 7 foot whatever, and so he is outside of the normal range of things, normal behavior. How about Albert Einstein? Was he deviant? Unbelievably, his creativity and his thought process was definitely outside there. But dysfunction is the key component with it. Distress or disability is kind of important. I'll just mention that I've had clients of mine that have said, that I've worked with, sex offenders specifically, pedophiles, that had said to me, well, this is not distressful for me at all. But the problem is that, that distress is not just about the person. In fact, many people with mental illnesses are not under distress. It's the people that are around them that are under distress. And so that's where we go back to that dysfunction. Are you able to complete the activities of daily living? Is your anxiety so severe that you're not able to get up and go to work? Is your depression so severe that you're not able to care for your children? Those type things are the big factors when we look at the 4 Ds of mental disorder. Starts out with neurodevelopmental disorders. These are disorders that are prominent during childhood. They include intellectual developmental disorder, what we formerly called mental retardation. That has been changed by Congress. Actually changed that from a emotionally laden word to the correct way of describing it. It's intellectual developmental disorder and learning disabilities. So the 2 subtypes of neurodevelopmental disorders that the text talks about. First is ADHD. That's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's actually 3 types of that. There is the inattentive type. There is the hyperactive impulsive type, and these are the ones that teachers can't stand because their kids are running around the classroom, but they're making A's in the class because they're paying attention while they're moving. And then there is the combined type, and they've got inattentive, hyperactive, and impulsive. The inattentive type, by the way, guys, is we see that more often in females than males. That may be, looking at our past chapter, social psychology, that may be a factor there of just gender expectations in our culture today. Let's see. Then we have autism, which is a very severe neurodevelopmental disorder. When we look at autism, it's kind of on a spectrum. Some are quite severe, unable to communicate. They also have social impairment combined with some type of repetitive behavior and inward focused behavior. I see a lot of those children in my practice. Some of the causes to that, it is kind of interesting. I mean, the text talks about the brain as being smaller, maybe due to genetic influences. We do see mirror neurons. Remember we talked about that a while ago? I had a sip of water and said what is happening in your brain is what I'm doing now. So the brain functions when we see what's being done. They have deficits in that area. There's been some research that ties it into the age of the father. So we have, because of changes we've seen in ways of managing fertility, we've seen people having children at older ages, and so there's some correlation to show that as you grow older, you're more, especially fathers, are more prone to have children in this with a neurodevelopmental disorder. It doesn't necessarily have to be autism than others. And then there's Asperger's, which still falls under the umbrella. They don't no longer define it as Asperger's. It used to be its own diagnosis. And that's somebody who's high functioning, no language impairment, but they have delays in or impaired social facilitation. Causes of it, again, latent genetic factors triggered by environmental conditions, ADHD, example, smoking while pregnant, sugar consumption can be a factor, understimulated brain, and so that's why we see they have a paradoxical reaction to stimulants. That's what Ritalin is. It's just a stimulant. While it would make you or me really hyper, it calms them down. So it's what they call a paradoxical reaction. Autism spectrum disorder, again, the brain is smaller than others at children, although the brain grows much faster during the first few years of life than non-autistic children. Children without autism. This brings us over to schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is an interesting disorder. It is probably one of the most debilitating mental disorders that are out there. There's different types of schizophrenia. It's a psychotic disorder, disorders of thought or perception, and inability to distinguish real from imagined perceptions. So usually there's a profound disturbance in thought and emotion. There's 3 categories of symptoms. First is positive symptoms. Positive is not that it's good, but it's that we can observe it. And so that is when they have hallucinations, auditory, olfactory, visual hallucinations, can have tactile hallucinations. I had one client who had this, people would be like, she would feel like fingers rubbing her arm if there's nobody there. Delusions, false beliefs, these are things that we can readily see. That's why they're called positive, not good. Then there's negative symptoms, and that's an emotionally flat affect. It's when you see it, you'll know it. There's no real response to no facial response to positive things. Usually no verbal responses to positive things. It's just like there's a disconnect there. And then cognitive symptoms we see with individuals with schizophrenia is they have problems with their working memory. That's that 1 + 2 is 3, times 2 is 6, times 2 is 12, divided by 3 is 4, that type of thing. That's that working memory. Problems with attention, verbal and visual learning, memory reasoning, problem solving. Those are also limitations of them. Some might engage in a thing called disordered speech, what we used to call word salad. They were just saying things that are unintelligible to them. They used to have, again, subtypes, but no longer. Now they've got, we see paranoid components of it, catatonic, undifferentiated. That means they just don't fit any specific subtype. Disorganized, no signs of catatonia. Of them all, by the way, paranoid, schizophrenia are probably the most successful as far as having what they call prodromal periods. Usually, when we look at what causes it, it's a nature nurtures, the diathesis model. diathesis stress model, and that's something it's going to be a resounding theme throughout this chapter. Essentially, diathesis stress model says we have a predisposition towards a mental illness, and it's when we're under stress it acts as a trigger to turn it on. That's essentially what diathesis stress model is. Biological, genetic predisposition, 70 to 85% heritability rate. Environment, again, genes epigenetically turned on and off by environmental experiences. Abuse can be a factor that causes it. These are turn the switch on, maternal infections. That's why we see more people being born between the winter months than later months due to flu-like symptoms that the mother might be exposed to while pregnant. Certainly there's abnormal brain development with larger cavities of cerebral spinal fluid within the brain, kind of like Alzheimer's, except not quite as extreme. Let's see. We go through. There's a neurochemistry of schizophrenia, the dopamine hypotheses. That means that there's a theory that they have high levels of dopamine, and that's what's causing it. And the way they found that out is they did a study on people with Parkinson's. Parkinson's have low levels of dopamine, so if you give them L-DOPA, if you give them too much, they begin to have schizophrenic-like symptoms. Just going to have some highlights, guys. Mood disorders, DSM-5 identifies several forms of it. Depression is primarily what we're talking about, guys, here, and depression and bipolar disorder. And again, the text talks about nature versus nurture and some different attributes to it. I'm not going to go into all the details with it just because of brevity's sake. Anxiety disorders, that is probably one of the easiest things to treat is anxiety disorder. So if you have someone out there who has anxiety disorder, I really encourage them to seek help. It's probably one of the simplest things to take care of. Some nice strategies to help resolve it. Talk about generalized anxiety disorder. That's that free-floating anxiety that you just can't put your finger on. Panic disorder with or without agoraphobia. So these are like panic attacks with or without agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is when you're isolating yourself slower and slower and slower into a smaller room to a place where you can't leave because of fears of having panic attacks and not being in a safe place. Sociophobia, phobia persistent, unreasonable fear of particular object, situation, or activity. Again, an easy thing to take care of. Usually it's a fear of embarrassing themselves or humiliating themselves and being evaluated by others. We talked about agoraphobia already. Specific phobias, that's usually an intense fear about one specific object like a dog or a cat or a snake or something. One object. Again, the diathesis stress model comes into play here. We've got a predisposition genetically, and then we've got some type of stressor that creates the disorder. Typically, they're going to have deficiencies in GABA. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It helps us put our brakes on things when things are going bad for us. Genetic heritability is 30 to 40%. And then high neuroticism. Remember 5-factor model with McRae and Costa. Somebody's just prone to being anxious. Let's go through obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety of both thought and behavior. Where there's an obsession, some unwanted thought, and then they have some compulsive behavior to remove that unwanted thought. They can just have one obsession, it can just have compulsion, but usually the two are combined. Post-traumatic stress disorder, very difficult disorder to manage, just because it hits all these different parts of the brain, and so it's very tricky to work with, and certainly to live with for sure. Dissociative disorders, that's individuals that have got more than one personality or dissociative identity disorder. Somatic symptom disorders, again, very interesting when you have somatic complaints. Joseph Pulitzer is kind of an example of this. He was blind without a cause for years and years and years. And then they look at personality disorders. I like the personality disorders. There's 3 distinct clusters. My favorite one is the odd eccentric. This is schizoid, schizotypal, paranoid. These are the people you're going to see in the streets wearing different clothes and different things, or shut away and, the hermits. Then there is the dramatic emotional, and this is histrionic, borderline, narcissistic, antisocial, and then anxious, fearful, avoidant, dependent, obsessive, compulsive. Of them, the first cluster, odd, eccentric, they're not going to come to a psychologist. Dramatic and emotional, more likely to be borderlines, and histrionics are more likely to come. Narcissistic, antisocial are coming because they're forced to. Anxious and fearful, they might come, although none of them are going to say there's anything wrong with them. Like, for example, even borderline is going to say, well, I have depression, or I have anxiety, or I pick bad guys, that type of thing. They're not going to say there's anything wrong with them. And that, guys, pretty much finishes up the chapter. And so, again, it's an interesting chapter. We have a whole course on it in abnormal psychology. I hope that you enjoy it. It's fascinating to me as I read through it to see the way the human brain works. We looked at personality, and now this is like when things go wrong within the personality. So, hope that you enjoy it very much. All right, we'll see you in our next chapter, guys. Thank you.